What drives someone to commit the unthinkable? It's a question that's been asked for centuries in countless courtrooms by countless people trying to understand the darkness that can lead one human being to harm another. But the story of the first crime didn't take place in a courtroom, and there was no jury to decide the verdict. It happened long before any of that existed, between two brothers who, on the surface, seemed to have it all: a family, a purpose, and a relationship with God. Yet in the quiet of the fields, away from prying eyes, something unimaginable happened. Cain killed Abel, and in that moment, history was forever marked by the first act of violence between man and man. But let's back up a bit. Before the murder, there was a relationship, and like many sibling relationships, it was complicated. Cain was the firstborn, the older brother who had the weight of expectation on his shoulders. He tilled the ground, working the soil that had been cursed when his parents, Adam and Eve, were banished from Eden. Imagine the frustration Cain must have felt, working with a ground that was stubborn, unyielding, the kind of ground that didn't give up its fruit easily. Abel, on the other hand, was the younger brother, a shepherd who tended to the flocks. His work was different, perhaps more peaceful, and his offering to God, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock, was met with favor. And that's where the trouble started. God looked with favor on Abel's offering, but on Cain's offering, he did not. Now, the Bible doesn't give us a detailed explanation as to why this happened, and we're left to wonder what it was about Cain's offering that didn't sit right. Was it the quality, the attitude behind it? Or maybe it was a reflection of Cain's heart, resentful, bitter, feeling as though he was always second best. Whatever the reason, Cain was furious. And let's be real, who wouldn't be? Imagine giving your best, only to be told it's not enough. It's the kind of rejection that cuts deep, especially when it's your little brother who seems to be getting all the praise. Sibling rivalry is as old as time itself. Who hasn't experienced that twinge of jealousy when a sibling seems to be the favorite, or when their accomplishments overshadow your own? It's the stuff of countless family feuds, and if we're being honest, it's something we've all felt at some point. But for Cain, that twinge of jealousy turned into something much darker. God saw what was happening in Cain's heart and warned him, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." It was like a red flag, a flashing neon sign saying, "Hey, stop, don't go down this path." But Cain couldn't or wouldn't listen. The bitterness had taken root, and it was growing into something dangerous. And then it happened. Cain invited Abel to the fields, away from anyone who could intervene. Maybe Abel thought it was just a chance to talk, to clear the air. But Cain had something else in mind. Fueled by rage, jealousy, and a sense of rejection, Cain killed his brother. The Bible doesn't give us the gory details. There's no need. The act itself is shocking enough. Cain, the firstborn, the one who was supposed to lead, protect, and care for his family, became the first murderer. And in that moment, the world was changed forever. Death, which had entered the world through Adam and Eve's sin, now claimed its first human victim, not by natural causes, but by the hands of another. So what drove Cain to commit the unthinkable? Was it the rejection he felt from God, the jealousy that festered until it consumed him? Or was it something deeper, a sense of inadequacy, of never being good enough, that finally exploded in violence? It's easy to see Cain as the villain of the story, the bad guy who let his emotions get the best of him. But if we're honest, there's a little bit of Cain in all of us. We've all felt that sting of rejection, the envy that bubbles up when someone else gets what we think we deserve. We've all had moments where we've let our anger control us, where we've said or done something we regret. And that's why the story of Cain and Abel still resonates today. It's not just a story about two brothers, it's a story about all of us. It's about the human condition, about the struggle between good and evil that takes place in every heart. It's about the choices we make when we're hurt, when we feel like we're not enough, when we're tempted to lash out rather than forgive. Cain's story is our story in a way. It's a reminder that sin is always crouching at the door, waiting for an opportunity to pounce, but we have the power to choose a different path. But here's the thing. Cain didn't just commit the first murder, he also faced the first consequences of such an act. When God confronted him asking, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain responded with those famous words, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It's a question that echoes through the ages, a question that gets to the heart of what it means to be human. Are we responsible for one another? Do we have a duty to protect, to care, to watch over those around us? Cain's answer was one of deflection, of denial. But God's response was clear. "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The blood of Abel cried out for justice, and God heard it. He didn't let Cain off the hook, but he also didn't give him the punishment that Cain feared most, death. Instead, God placed a curse on Cain, one that would mark him as a wanderer, someone who would never again find a home, a place of rest. But even in this punishment, there was a measure of mercy. God placed a mark on Cain to protect him from those who might seek to harm him, a mark that would serve as both a reminder of his crime and a shield from further violence. And here's where it gets interesting. Even though Cain committed the first murder, even though he was banished to a life of wandering, God didn't abandon him completely. There was still grace, still protection, even in the midst of judgment. It's a complicated story, one that doesn't fit neatly into categories of good and evil, right and wrong. Cain was guilty, yes, but he was also a victim of his own emotions, of the weight of expectations, of the curse of sin that had entered the world. So what can we learn from Cain's story today? For one thing, it's a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked anger and jealousy. But it's also a story of grace, of how even in our darkest moments, God doesn't abandon us. He may discipline us, He may allow us to face the consequences of our actions, but He never leaves us without hope. Cain's story is tragic, yes, but it's also a story of God's justice tempered with mercy. As we reflect on Cain's story, it's worth asking ourselves some tough questions. How do we handle feelings of jealousy or rejection? Do we let them fester, like Cain did, until they lead us down a destructive path? Or do we confront them, bring them into the light, and seek healing before it's too late? And what about our responsibilities to others? Are we our brother's keeper? Do we take seriously the call to care for those around us, to protect the vulnerable, to watch over our loved ones? Cain's story may be ancient, but its lessons are timeless. It challenges us to look at our own hearts, to recognize the ways in which we're tempted to respond to pain with anger, to injustice with violence. It reminds us that we have a choice, that sin may be crouching at the door, but we can rule over it. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even when we fail, even when we make terrible mistakes, God's grace is still available to us. There may be consequences, yes, but there's also the possibility of redemption, of finding a way forward, even when the past seems darkest. So the next time you feel that twinge of jealousy, that rush of anger, remember Cain. Remember the choices he made and the price he paid. But also remember the grace that God extended to him, the mark that protected him even in his exile. Because if there's one thing Cain's story teaches us, it's that no matter how far we've fallen, no matter what we've done, God's mercy is never out of reach. We've all got our marks, right? Whether it's that one time you thought bangs would be a good idea, spoiler alert, they weren't, or that embarrassing nickname your friends refuse to let go of, there's always something that sticks with us. It's like life hands us little reminders, some funny, some not so much, of who we are and where we've been. But what if your mark wasn't just an inside joke or a bad fashion choice, but something much more significant? Something that set you apart in ways you couldn't escape? Enter the mark of Cain. Now, Cain's story had already taken a dark turn by this point. He'd committed the first murder, killed his own brother, and was confronted by God himself. But here's where things get even more interesting. After Cain confesses his fear that anyone who finds him will kill him, God does something unexpected. Instead of leaving Cain to face the harsh consequences on his own, God places a mark on him. This mark, whatever it looked like, was meant to protect Cain from being killed by others. So, was it a curse, a sign of mercy, or somehow both? Let's break it down. On one hand, the mark was a clear symbol of judgment. Cain had committed a grave sin, and this mark was a constant reminder of his crime. He couldn't escape it, couldn't hide from it. It was there for everyone to see. It marked him as different, as someone who had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Imagine living with that kind of visible reminder every single day. It's like having a giant neon sign over your head that says, "I messed up, big time." Not exactly the kind of thing you'd want to advertise, right? But on the other hand, the mark wasn't just about punishment, it was also about protection. God's mark on Cain was a signal to the rest of the world. Don't touch him. Even after everything Cain had done, God still cared enough to ensure his survival. It's a bit of a paradox, really. Cain deserved punishment, but God tempered that punishment with mercy. He didn't take Cain's life, and he made sure no one else would either. It's as if God was saying, "Yes, you've sinned, but you're still under my care." This brings us to an interesting question. How do we interpret the mark of Cain? Was it a curse meant to forever remind Cain of his sin? Or was it an act of mercy, a sign that God's grace was still at work even in the midst of judgment? The answer might just be both. In the Bible, judgment and mercy often go hand in hand. God's justice is real, but so is his compassion, and Cain's mark embodies that tension between the two. Now let's get personal for a minute. We all carry marks of one kind or another. Maybe they're physical scars, the result of an accident or an illness, or maybe they're emotional scars, memories of mistakes we've made, regrets that haunt us, things we wish we could undo. These marks, like Cain's, remind us of our past, of the times we've fallen short. They can feel like burdens, weights that drag us down and keep us from moving forward. But here's the thing. Just like Cain's mark, our marks can also be symbols of something more. They can be reminders of lessons learned, of grace received, of the fact that we've survived whatever it was that marked us in the first place. Think about it. How many times have you looked at a scar, physical or emotional, and remembered not just the pain, but also the healing that followed? Maybe that scar reminds you of a tough time you went through, but also of the strength you found to get through it. Or maybe it's a reminder of a mistake you made, but one that taught you something valuable, something you carry with you to this day. In that sense, our marks are not just curses, they're also signs of mercy, of God's presence in our lives, even when things get messy. Cain's mark was visible for all to see, but the marks we carry might be more hidden. We might not have a physical sign that tells the world about our past, but those marks are there, just the same. They shape who we are, how we see ourselves, and how we interact with the world around us. The question is, do we see those marks as purely negative, as things to be ashamed of? Or do we see them as part of our story, as evidence of God's work in our lives, even in the midst of our struggles? Let's be honest. It's easy to focus on the negative. When we think about our mistakes, our regrets, it's tempting to get stuck in a cycle of guilt and shame. We replay our failures over and over in our minds, letting them define us, letting them tell us who we are. But what if we looked at those marks differently? What if we saw them not just as signs of our failures, but as signs of God's mercy? What if we remembered that, just like with Cain, God's response to our sin isn't just judgment, it's also grace. The mark of Cain is a powerful symbol, one that resonates with all of us because it speaks to the reality of living in a broken world. We all make mistakes, we all carry scars, but the good news is that those marks don't have to define us in a negative way. They can be reminders of God's mercy, of His willingness to protect us even when we don't deserve it. They can be symbols of the fact that no matter what we've done, God doesn't abandon us. But here's the tricky part: accepting that mercy. Cain's story could have gone in a different direction. He could have embraced the mercy God offered, could have used his time as a wanderer to seek redemption, to find a way back to God. But the Bible tells us that Cain went on to build a city, to try and create something permanent in a life that was meant to be marked by wandering. It's almost as if Cain refused to fully accept the consequences of his actions or the mercy that came with them. He tried to create his own destiny, to defy the mark that God had placed on him. And don't we do the same thing sometimes? When we're marked by something, whether it's a mistake, a failure, or a difficult experience, we often try to compensate by building our own cities, by creating a sense of control in our lives. We want to prove that we're not defined by our past, that we can move on and create something new. And while there's nothing wrong with trying to move forward, it's important to recognize when we're doing it out of a place of denial rather than acceptance. So what does it mean to truly accept the marks we carry? It means acknowledging the mistakes, the regrets, the pain, but also recognizing the grace that's present in those moments. It means understanding that God's mercy is bigger than our failures, and that His protection is still with us, even when we feel like we're wandering. It means seeing our marks not just as signs of judgment, but as symbols of the grace that's always available to us. As we think about the mark of Cain, let's take a moment to reflect on the marks we carry. What are the things in your life that remind you of your past? How do those marks affect the way you see yourself, the way you live your life? Are they sources of shame, or have you found a way to see them as part of your story, as evidence of God's grace? And here's the final thought to leave you with. Maybe, just maybe, those marks aren't just reminders of where we've been. They're also signposts pointing us to where we're going. They're part of the journey, part of the process of becoming who God created us to be. They remind us that we're not defined by our mistakes, but by God's grace. And in that, there's hope. There's always hope. Have you ever found yourself wandering around a new city, completely lost, no idea where you're going? Maybe you're holding your phone in one hand, squinting at Google Maps, trying to figure out if you should turn left or right, and all the while, the little blue dot is just spinning and spinning and spinning. It's like the universe's way of reminding you that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you're just lost. But here's the thing. Being lost isn't just about geography, is it? It's about that deep down, unsettling feeling of not quite belonging, of not knowing where you fit in, or even if you fit in at all. And if anyone knew that feeling, it was Cain. After killing his brother, Cain was sentenced to a life of wandering. God told him that he would be a restless wanderer on the earth, and honestly, that sounds like one of the worst punishments imaginable. No home, no place to settle, no roots to plant, just endless movement, a journey with no destination. Cain's exile wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. He was cut off from his family, from his land, and, in a way, from God. It's the ultimate story of alienation, of being lost in the truest sense of the word. But let's take a step back. What does it mean to be a restless wanderer? Sure, it's easy to imagine Cain trudging across deserts and through forests, but the real weight of his punishment was in the loneliness, the isolation. There's something about not having a place to call home that strikes at the core of the human condition. We all crave connection, stability, a sense of belonging. And when that's taken away, it's like the ground beneath our feet disappears. We're left floating, adrift, searching for something to hold on to. And isn't that a feeling we've all experienced at some point? Maybe it's when you move to a new city for a job and find yourself sitting in a tiny apartment, wondering why you feel so alone, even though you're surrounded by millions of people. Or maybe it's when life throws you a curveball, a breakup, a job loss, a major change, and suddenly everything you thought you knew is up in the air. You're wandering, not just in a physical sense, but emotionally, spiritually. You're searching for something solid, something that makes you feel grounded. Cain's story is a reminder that wandering isn't just about the physical journey, it's about the inner one too. When we feel disconnected, when we're struggling to find our place in the world, it can feel like we're just drifting, like nothing really makes sense. It's that sense of being lost in a bigger, more existential way. And in today's world, where everything moves so fast, where connections are often fleeting, that feeling of being a restless wanderer is something a lot of us can relate to. Think about it. How often do we find ourselves searching for meaning, for purpose? We move from job to job, relationship to relationship, city to city, all in the hopes of finding that place where we truly belong. But sometimes, no matter how hard we try, that sense of belonging feels just out of reach. We're like Cain, wandering the earth, trying to make sense of our lives, trying to find that elusive thing that will make us feel at home. But here's the twist. Maybe the wandering itself is part of the journey. Cain was sentenced to be a wanderer, yes, but in that wandering, there was an opportunity for growth, for change. Sometimes when we're lost, when we're wandering, that's when we're most open to new experiences, new perspectives. It's in those moments of disconnection that we start to question things, to dig deeper into who we are and what we really want out of life. Take the story of the prodigal son, for example. He wandered far from home, squandered his inheritance, and ended up feeding pigs. About as lost as you can get. But it was in that lostness, in that moment of hitting rock bottom, that he realized where he truly belonged. He returned home, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. His wandering led him back to where he was meant to be, but with a new understanding of himself and his place in the world. And maybe that's what Cain's story is really about. Yes, he was a restless wanderer, but that restlessness can also lead to self-discovery, to finding a new way forward. It's not easy and it's not comfortable, but it's part of the human experience. We wander, we search, we feel lost. But in that process, we also learn, we grow, we find new meaning. Of course, wandering isn't always voluntary. Sometimes it's forced upon us, like it was for Cain. And that can be incredibly difficult. When life takes away the things that made us feel secure, our home, our relationships, our sense of purpose, it's natural to feel adrift, like a ship without an anchor. But even in those moments, there's a possibility for something more. There's a chance to redefine who we are, to discover new strengths, new possibilities. Cain's story reminds us that even when we feel most lost, most disconnected, we're not alone. There's something deeply human about the experience of wandering, about the search for belonging. It's something we all go through at some point, and it's a reminder that our journey, as difficult as it might be, has value. It's in the wandering that we often find what we're truly looking for, even if it's not what we expected. And let's be honest, sometimes getting lost is the best way to find yourself. It's when we're pushed out of our comfort zones, when we're forced to confront the unknown, that we really start to understand who we are and what we're made of. It's not easy, and it's definitely not always fun, but it's part of the process. It's part of what makes us human. So as we think about Cain's wandering, let's not just see it as a punishment. Let's see it as a reflection of our own journeys, our own searches for meaning and belonging. Let's acknowledge the loneliness, the fear, the uncertainty, but also the growth, the discovery, the possibility that comes with being a wanderer. Because in the end, we're all searching for something, whether it's a place to call home, a sense of purpose, or a deeper connection to the world around us. And maybe, just maybe, the wandering is what helps us find it. Maybe it's what leads us to those moments of clarity, those insights that change the course of our lives. Maybe the wandering is what makes the eventual arrival, wherever that may be, all the more meaningful. Because when you've been lost, when you've truly wandered, finding your way home, whatever home might mean, becomes an act of grace, of redemption. So the next time you feel lost, the next time you find yourself wandering, whether in a new city or in the depths of your own mind, remember Cain. Remember that wandering isn't just about being lost. It's about the journey, about discovering who you are and where you belong. And even if the path is uncertain, even if you feel like you're just spinning that little blue dot on the map, keep going. Because in the end, the wandering might just lead you to exactly where you're meant to be. You ever notice how the smallest arguments can blow up into the biggest battles? I mean, take something as simple as deciding who gets the last slice of pizza. It starts off with polite offers. No, you take it. No, really, I insist. And before you know it, people are arm wrestling over that greasy piece of heaven like it's the last meal on earth. All jokes aside, it's funny how little things can escalate. But what happens when the stakes are much higher? When it's not about pizza, but about something deeper, something that taps into our primal instincts? Cain's story is the original tale of escalation gone horribly wrong. It began with jealousy, a feeling that many of us can relate to, but it quickly spiraled into the first act of violence in human history. One moment, Cain was frustrated that God seemed to favor Abel's offering, and the next, Well, let's just say that Abel was no longer around to enjoy any future sacrifices. And that single act of violence set off a chain reaction that echoes through history, even to this day. But why did it escalate so quickly? Why did Cain's jealousy lead to such a drastic outcome? It's easy to dismiss it as an ancient story, far removed from our modern lives. But the truth is, we see this same pattern play out over and over again. Violence begets violence, and once that cycle starts, it's hard to stop. Just think about it. How many conflicts, both big and small, have started with something as simple as a misunderstanding, an insult, or a perceived slight? It's like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline, and before you know it, everything's on fire. Now let's fast forward a few thousand years from Cain and Abel's time to our world today. Unfortunately, we've seen that the cycle of violence Cain began as alive and well. Whether it's bullying in schools, gang violence in cities, or full-blown wars between nations, the seeds of Cain's anger seem to have taken root in every corner of the globe. And the sad part is, it often starts with something small, something that could have been resolved peacefully if cooler heads had prevailed. Let's talk about bullying for a moment. It's one of those issues that's as old as time, but it feels particularly relevant today, especially with the rise of social media. What starts as a few mean comments online can quickly escalate into something much more harmful. It's almost like the digital age has given Cain's jealousy a new playground, where words can be just as deadly as any physical weapon. And the consequences? Devastating. Lives are ruined, families are torn apart, and the cycle of violence continues, passed down from one generation to the next. And what about war? Wars don't just happen overnight. They're the result of years, sometimes decades, of simmering tensions, misunderstandings, and unresolved conflicts. Just like Cain's anger festered until it erupted in violence, so too do the grievances between nations build up until diplomacy fails, and the only option left is conflict. And once that first shot is fired, it's like there's no turning back. The cycle of violence takes over, and the world watches as lives are lost, communities are destroyed, and the scars of war are left for future generations to deal with. But here's the thing, violence doesn't just happen on a large scale. It's not just about wars or schoolyard bullies. It's also about the little moments in our own lives when we let anger and frustration get the better of us. Think about the last time you had a fight with a friend or family member. Did it start with something small, something that, in hindsight, seems almost trivial? And did it escalate, with both sides digging in, refusing to back down, until it became a full-blown argument? It's that same cycle, playing out on a personal level, but with consequences that can be just as painful. And let's be real, it's so easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment. Maybe you've had a long day, you're stressed out, and someone says the wrong thing at the wrong time. Before you know it, you're yelling, they're yelling, and suddenly you're in the middle of a conflict that you never intended to start. It's like that old saying, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. But in the moment, it feels impossible to see that it's just a molehill, doesn't it? So what do? How do we break this cycle of violence that started with Cain and seems to have woven itself into the fabric of human history? The answer isn't simple, but it starts with awareness. It starts with recognizing when we're falling into the same trap that Cain did. Letting our anger, our jealousy, our need to be right lead us down a path that ends in hurt and destruction. One way to break the cycle is by practicing empathy. Easier said than done, I know, especially when emotions are running high. But imagine if Cain had paused, even for a moment, to consider Abel's perspective. What if he had talked to Abel instead of harboring resentment? What if he had sought to understand instead of choosing violence? It's a question we can all ask ourselves the next time we feel anger bubbling up. What would happen if I took a step back, tried to see the other person's point of view, and chose a different path? Another way to break the cycle is by recognizing the power of forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone off the hook or pretending that nothing happened. It means choosing not to let anger control us, not to let the cycle continue. When we forgive, we're not just setting the other person free, we're setting ourselves free too. We're saying, this ends with me. And in a world that's so often driven by revenge and retribution, that's a powerful statement. And then there's the importance of community. Cain became a wanderer, cut off from his family and from society? But what if instead of pushing others away, we chose to draw closer, to build stronger connections? When we're part of a supportive community, it's easier to keep our emotions in check, to seek help when we're struggling, and to resolve conflicts peacefully. We need each other, now more than ever. And when we're connected, we're less likely to fall into the traps that Cain did. It's also worth thinking about the role that education plays in breaking the cycle of violence. Teaching kids from a young age about conflict resolution, about the importance of empathy and understanding, can make a huge difference. Imagine a generation that grows up learning not just math and science, but also how to navigate their emotions, how to resolve disputes without resorting to violence. It's not a cure-all, but it's a step in the right direction. So as we reflect on Cain's legacy and the way his act of violence set off a chain reaction that still affects us today, let's ask ourselves, how can we break the cycle in our own lives? How can we choose peace over conflict, understanding over anger, connection over isolation? It's not easy, and it's not something that happens overnight. But with each small step, with each act of empathy, forgiveness, and community building, we move closer to a world where the legacy of violence is replaced by a legacy of peace. Because here's the truth. Cain's story doesn't have to be our story. Yes, violence begets violence, but peace begets peace. And it starts with us. It starts with the choices we make every day, in the small moments, in the way we treat each other, in the way we handle our own anger and frustration. It starts with breaking the cycle, one decision at a time, until slowly but surely, the world becomes a place where peace is the norm, not the exception. And who knows, maybe one day we'll look back and see that the cycle of violence that began with Cain was finally broken. Not by one grand gesture, but by countless small acts of kindness, understanding, and love. Because in the end, that's the true legacy we want to leave behind, isn't it? A legacy of peace, of connection, of a world where the cycle of violence is nothing more than a distant memory. Is it just me? Or does it feel like Mondays are cursed? Seriously, it's like the universe collectively agrees to throw all the worst stuff at us as soon as the weekend ends. You drag yourself out of bed, somehow spill coffee on your last clean shirt, and by the time you sit down to work, it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You're just trying to get through the day, but everything seems to be fighting against you. It's almost as if the ground itself refuses to cooperate, like it's cursed or something. And if anyone knew what that felt like, it was Cain. After Cain committed the first murder, God placed a curse on him that hit him right where it hurt, his work. The ground which Cain had spent his life tilling would no longer yield its strength to him. Imagine that for a second. Cain's livelihood, his purpose, was tied to the land. He was a farmer, someone who worked the soil, planted seeds and watched them grow. But now, no matter how hard he worked, the ground would betray him. It wouldn't produce as it once did, and his efforts would be met with frustration and failure. Talk about a rough Monday. But this curse wasn't just about making life difficult for Cain. It was about cutting him off from the source of his purpose, leaving him to wander without a clear direction. And honestly, who hasn't felt that way at some point? Whether it's struggling to find satisfaction in your job, feeling like you're not making progress, or just wondering what your purpose in life really is, we all face those moments when it feels like the ground beneath us has turned against us. No matter how hard we try, we can't seem to get ahead. Let's talk about that feeling for a moment. You know the one, the sense that you're spinning your wheels, working hard but getting nowhere. Maybe you're stuck in a job that doesn't fulfill you, but you can't leave because, well, bills don't pay themselves. Or maybe you're chasing a dream, but every door you try to open slams shut in your face. It's frustrating, demoralizing, and after a while, it starts to feel like the whole world is conspiring against you. Cain's curse was literal, but in a way, we all experience our own versions of it. Take job dissatisfaction, for example. It's something most of us have dealt with at one time or another. You show up to work every day, but there's this nagging feeling that you're meant for something more, something different. Maybe the work you're doing doesn't align with your passions, or maybe the environment is toxic, draining the life out of you. You put in the hours, but at the end of the day, It feels like you've accomplished nothing. It's like you're planting seeds in barren soil, and no matter how much you water them, they just won't grow. And then there's the frustration of unfulfilled dreams. Remember when you were a kid and the possibilities seemed endless? You were going to be an astronaut, a rock star, or maybe even the president. But somewhere along the way, reality set in. Life got complicated, responsibilities piled up, and those dreams started to feel out of reach. You try to chase them, but the roadblocks keep coming, and after a while, it's tempting to just give up. It's as if the curse of the ground has followed you, turning your dreams to dust before they can take root. But here's the thing. Even in the midst of these struggles, there's something deeper at work. Cain's story reminds us that while the curse made his work harder, it didn't make it impossible. The ground might not yield its strength easily, but that doesn't mean it's completely barren. It's about persistence, about pushing through the frustration and finding new ways to cultivate purpose in your life. It's about understanding that the challenges we face, the obstacles that seem insurmountable, are often the very things that shape us, that teach us resilience and perseverance. Let's take a look at some real-life examples. How many successful people can you think of who didn't face setbacks, who didn't have to overcome major challenges to get where they are? Steve Jobs was fired from his own company before returning to turn Apple into a tech giant. Oprah Winfrey faced poverty, abuse, and countless rejections before becoming the media mogul she is today. These are people who, like Cain, faced their own versions of the curse but refused to let it define them. They found ways to keep going, to turn their struggles into strengths, and it's not just about big, flashy successes. Sometimes it's the small victories that matter most. Maybe you're not where you want to be in your career, but you're taking steps to get there, learning new skills, networking, or even just surviving another day in a tough job. Or maybe you've faced rejection after rejection in pursuit of your dream, but you keep trying, keep pushing forward, because you know that giving up isn't an option. It's about finding purpose, even when the ground seems cursed, and refusing to let that curse have the final say. But it's not all about work either. The curse of the ground can manifest in other areas of life, relationships, personal growth, even our spiritual journeys. There are times when everything feels like an uphill battle, when you're trying to connect with others but keep hitting walls, or when you're seeking meaning but coming up empty. It's during these times that Cain's story resonates most. His curse was a burden, yes, but it also forced him to confront his own limitations, to find new ways to survive, and ultimately to grow. And here's where the conversation gets really interesting. What if the challenges we face, the curses in our own lives, are actually opportunities in disguise? What if the struggles with work, purpose, and direction are meant to push us towards something greater? Something we wouldn't have found otherwise? It's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you're in the middle of it. But there's a lot of truth in the idea that adversity builds character. It's through the hard times that we discover what we're really made of. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should all jump for joy every time something goes wrong. Frustration, disappointment, and the feeling of being stuck are real and they're not fun. But what if we could reframe those experiences? What if instead of seeing them as dead ends, we saw them as detours, as chances to explore new paths, new possibilities? What if the curse of the ground is really just another way of saying, keep going, you're stronger than you think? It's also worth considering how our faith plays into this. The Bible is full of stories of people who faced seemingly insurmountable challenges, but found strength in their faith. Job lost everything, but remained steadfast in his belief. Joseph was sold into slavery, thrown into prison, and yet rose to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt. Even Jesus faced incredible suffering, but through it, he brought redemption to the world. These stories remind us that our struggles are not in vain, that there's a bigger picture, a greater purpose at work. So how do we apply this to our own lives? For one, we can start by embracing the idea that challenges are part of the journey. They're not just obstacles to overcome. They're opportunities to learn, to grow, to discover new strengths we didn't know we had. We can also look for ways to find purpose in the midst of struggle, whether it's by redefining what success looks like, seeking out new passions, or simply finding joy in the small things. And finally, we can lean into our faith, trusting that God is with us, even when the ground feels cursed. Cain may have been marked and sent to wander, but he was never abandoned. Neither are we. Our struggles, our frustrations, our feelings of being lost, these are all part of a bigger story, one that's still being written. And in the end, it's a story of redemption, of finding purpose, even in the midst of a cursed ground. So the next time you're having one of those cursed Mondays, when nothing seems to go right and the weight of the world feels too heavy to bear, remember Cain. Remember that while the curse made his work harder, it didn't make it meaningless. And remember that in your own life, the challenges you face are not just curses, they're opportunities. They're chances to dig deeper, to find new ways to cultivate purpose, and to discover that even in the hardest of times, growth is possible. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, that cursed ground you're walking on will one day yield a harvest greater than you ever imagined. Because in the end, it's not about the curse, it's about what you do with it. It's about finding meaning, purpose, and strength in the midst of struggle, and letting that be the legacy you leave behind. Isn't it funny how humans just love to build things? Whether it's towering skyscrapers that seem to kiss the sky, intricate sandcastles that will inevitably be washed away by the tide, or those maddening IKEA furniture pieces that somehow always leave you with one extra screw. There's something in us that drives us to create, to leave our mark on the world. It's like we're hardwired to build, to construct something that says, I was here. And Cain, despite everything, wasn't any different. Now let's remember where Cain was at this point. He'd just been cursed to be a restless wanderer, forever moving, never really finding a place to call home. It was like the universe was telling him, you're not meant to settle, keep moving. But what does Cain do? He goes and builds a city. Yep, you heard that right. The guy who's supposed to be wandering decides to plant some roots, or at least he tries to. It's almost as if he's saying, you think I can't build something lasting? Watch me. Cain's decision to build a city feels like a bold, defiant move. It's like he was challenging the very fate that had been handed to him. Instead of accepting his life as a wanderer, Cain tries to create something permanent, something that will outlive him. And honestly, who can blame him? Isn't that what we all want on some level? To build something that lasts, that leaves a legacy that says, I was here and I mattered. But here's where things get interesting. Cain's attempt to build a city wasn't just about defying his curse. It was about trying to control his narrative, to create a legacy that would outshine his dark past. He couldn't erase what he'd done, but maybe he could build something that would make people remember him for something else, something bigger. It's a classic case of trying to build a name for yourself, even when the odds are stacked against you. And let's be real, we all do this in our own way. We're constantly building, whether it's our careers, our families, our reputations. We want to leave something behind that proves we were here, that we made a difference. Maybe it's a business, a work of art, or even just a happy, healthy family. Whatever it is, we're driven by this desire to create, to leave a legacy that will stand the test of time. But here's the thing. Why do we do it? Is it because we genuinely want to make the world a better place? Or is it because we're trying to prove something? Are we building out of passion and purpose, or out of fear and insecurity? Cain's story forces us to ask these tough questions. Was he building his city out of a genuine desire to create something good? Or was it more about trying to rewrite his story, to prove that he was more than just the guy who killed his brother? It's easy to look at Cain and judge him, to see his actions as a desperate attempt to defy his fate. But the truth is, we're all a little like Cain. We all have things in our past that we're not proud of, things we'd rather people forget. And so we build, hoping that our accomplishments, our successes, will overshadow our failures. We hope that by leaving something behind, we'll somehow make up for the mistakes we've made. But here's where we need to be careful. In our rush to build, to create, to leave a legacy, we can lose sight of what really matters. We can become so focused on the end goal that we forget to ask ourselves why we're doing it in the first place. Are we building for the right reasons? Or are we just trying to fill a void, to cover up the cracks with something shiny and new. Cain's story challenges us to think deeply about our own motivations. What are we trying to prove? And more importantly, who are we trying to prove it to? Is it about impressing others? About leaving something behind that will make people remember us? Or is it about something more, something deeper? There's nothing wrong with wanting to build, to create, to leave a legacy. But it's worth pausing to consider why we're doing it. Are we building something that will truly last, that will make a positive impact on the world? Or are we building something that looks impressive on the outside but is hollow on the inside? Maybe the most important thing we can build isn't a city, a career, or even a legacy. Maybe it's something less tangible, something that can't be measured in square footage or accolades. Maybe it's about building relationships, building character, building a life that reflects the values we hold dear. Because in the end, the things we build with love, with integrity, with purpose, those are the things that truly last. So as we think about Cain's city, let's also think about what we're building in our own lives. Are we creating something that reflects our best selves, our true selves? Or are we just trying to cover up the cracks, to build something that looks good on the outside but doesn't really satisfy on the inside? It's a tough question, but it's one worth asking. Because in the end, it's not just about what we build, it's about why we build it. And maybe, just maybe, the most important thing we can build is a life that's honest, that's authentic, that's true to who we are. A life that, like Cain's, is complex and flawed, but also full of potential, full of possibility, full of the chance to create something meaningful, something real. Who doesn't love a good villain? Whether it's the Joker causing chaos in Gotham City or Darth Vader making you question the dark side, villains have this magnetic pull on our imaginations. They're complex, they're troubled, and, let's face it, they often steal the show. But before there was the Joker or Darth Vader, there was Cain, arguably one of the first and perhaps one of the most tragic villains in history. In fact, Cain might just be the original bad guy, the one who set the stage for all those dark and brooding characters we love to hate, or sometimes just love. Cain's story is one of those tales that has been told and retold in countless ways, influencing art, literature, and film for centuries. There's something about his story, about the first murder, the first mark of guilt, that continues to resonate with us. It's like every time we encounter a tale of jealousy, betrayal, or the burden of guilt, we're revisiting Cain's legacy, whether we realize it or not. Take John Steinbeck's East of Eden, for example. If you haven't read it, it's a sprawling novel that explores the nature of good and evil through generations of two families. And right at the heart of it is Cain's story, reimagined in a modern context. Steinbeck even names two of his characters, Cal and Aaron, drawing a direct parallel to Cain and Abel. The novel digs deep into the themes of jealousy, rivalry, and the idea that we're all caught in this struggle between good and evil, between the parts of us that want to be loved and the parts of us that fear we're not good enough. Or how about movies? Cain's influence can be seen in countless films where sibling rivalry takes center stage. Think about The Lion King, where Scar's jealousy of Mufasa leads to betrayal and murder, a plot line that feels eerily similar to Cain and Abel. And let's not forget the classic East of Eden film, where James Dean's portrayal of Cal embodies that tortured, conflicted spirit of Cain, torn between seeking love and giving in to his darker impulses. Even in modern pop culture, you can find echoes of Cain's story. In the world of comic books, Marvel's X-Men features characters like Wolverine and Sabretooth, whose rivalry and animosity can be traced back to themes of brotherly conflict. And in TV shows like Supernatural, the story of Cain is reimagined in a way that blends ancient legend with modern storytelling, bringing the curse and its consequences into the present day. But why does Cain's story keep popping up in our art, our literature, our movies? What is it about this ancient tale that continues to captivate us? Well, it probably has something to do with the fact that Cain's story touches on some of the most universal themes of the human experience: jealousy, guilt, the desire for redemption. These are things that everyone can relate to on some level. We've all felt that sting of jealousy, that fear of being overshadowed by someone else. Whether it's a sibling who seems to have it all together, a coworker who always gets the promotion, or even a friend whose life seems just a little too perfect. We know what it's like to wrestle with envy. And in those moments, we can see a bit of Cain in ourselves, the part of us that struggles with our own feelings of inadequacy. And then there's the guilt. Cain's story is steeped in it, from the moment he strikes down Abel to the moment God marks him for his crime. It's a guilt that he can't escape, that follows him everywhere he goes. And isn't that something we all understand? The weight of guilt, the burden of knowing we've done something wrong, can be crushing. It's why characters like Cain resonate so deeply with us. They remind us of our own struggles with right and wrong, with the choices we make and the consequences that follow. But it's not all doom and gloom. Cain's story also speaks to the possibility of redemption, of finding a way back even after we've messed up. Sure, Cain's path was a difficult one, but the fact that his story continues to be told suggests that we're all searching for that chance at redemption, that hope that no matter how far we've fallen, there's a way to make things right. And that's why Cain's story will likely continue to influence our art and our culture for generations to come. It's a story that's as old as time, yet it feels just as relevant today as it did thousands of years ago. It reminds us of the complexity of the human condition, of the fact that we're all capable of both good and evil, and of the power of our choices to shape our destinies. So the next time you're watching a movie, reading a book, or even scrolling through a comic, keep an eye out for Cain. You might just spot him lurking in the shadows, reminding us that the struggles of the past are never too far from the present. After all, Cain's story isn't just about the first murder. It's about the first realization that we're all caught in this delicate balance between light and dark, between who we are and who we want to be. And isn't that the story of all great villains? The ones who challenge us, who make us think about our own lives, our own choices, and what it means to be human. Because in the end, Cain's story isn't just about him. It's about all of us, and the timeless battle we fight every day. The battle to be better, to overcome our darker impulses, and to find a way to leave behind a legacy we can be proud of. Who doesn't love a good redemption story? Whether it's a hero making a comeback, a villain finding a heart, or someone in real life turning their life around, there's something deeply satisfying about seeing someone rise from the ashes of their mistakes. It's like watching Rocky Balboa get back up after being knocked down, or seeing Ebenezer Scrooge wake up on Christmas morning with a heart full of generosity. We root for these characters because deep down, we all want to believe in second chances, in the idea that no one is beyond saving. But what about Cain? Could he have found redemption, or was he doomed from the start? It's easy to write off his story as a tragedy, a tale of jealousy, murder, and a life spent wandering. But let's take a step back and look at it through the lens of redemption and forgiveness. Because if there's one thing the Bible teaches us, it's that God's mercy can reach even the darkest corners of the human heart. Cain's story is a tough one, no doubt about it. After all, he committed the first murder in history, and his punishment was severe. But even in the midst of that punishment, God didn't abandon him. Remember the mark God placed on Cain? It wasn't just a sign of his guilt, it was also a sign of protection. God was essentially saying, yes, you've sinned, but you're still under my care. That's not something to gloss over. It's a reminder that even when we've messed up in ways that seem unforgivable, God's grace is still there, reaching out to us. And isn't that what redemption is all about? It's about the possibility of a new beginning, even after we've made a mess of things. It's about the idea that our past mistakes don't have to define our future. Cain's story could have gone in a different direction. Imagine if, instead of continuing down a dark path, he had sought forgiveness, had tried to make amends. The Bible doesn't tell us what ultimately became of Cain, but it leaves the door open to the possibility that he could have found redemption, that he could have been forgiven if he'd sought it out. This theme of redemption runs throughout the Bible, and it's not just limited to Cain. Think about the Apostle Paul, who started out as Saul, a man who persecuted Christians with a vengeance. By all accounts, Saul was a lost cause. But then he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, and everything changed. Paul went on to become one of the most influential figures in Christianity, proving that no one is beyond redemption. And it's not just biblical figures who find redemption. We see it in the world around us, in the lives of people who've turned things around in incredible ways. Maybe it's the addict who's found sobriety, the estranged family members who've reconciled, or the former criminal who's now working to help others avoid the mistakes he made. These stories resonate with us because they remind us of the power of forgiveness, of the possibility of change. So as we think about Cain, let's not just see his story as a tragedy. Let's consider the possibility of redemption, of what might have been if Cain had sought forgiveness, if he turned back to God. And let's ask ourselves, what does this story teach us about our own capacity for forgiveness? Are we holding on to grudges, convinced that some people are beyond saving? Or are we open to the idea that, like Cain, anyone can find redemption if they're willing to seek it? In the end, Cain's story challenges us to look at our own lives, to consider where we might need to offer or seek forgiveness, and to remember that redemption is always possible, no matter how far we've strayed, because in God's eyes, no one is ever too far gone to be brought back home. That's it, everyone. What do you think of Cain's journey and the possibility of redemption in his story? Which part resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments section and let us know if there's another biblical tale of redemption or forgiveness you'd like us to dive into next. Don't forget to subscribe for more insightful explorations like this one, and be sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's continue this journey together, because every story has the potential for redemption.